Auto exposure bracketing and exposure compensation. Exposure bracketing means that you take several pictures of the same subject, each with a different exposure. One is underexposed, one overexposed, and one correctly exposed. This allows you to select or combine the best exposures for your image. The auto exposure bracketing feature of the EOS 6D makes this a quick process. Bracketed exposures can be taken in the program, shutter priority, aperture priority, and manual exposure modes. Auto bracketing can be done with either single frame advance or continuous advance. In single frame advance, you must depress the shutter button for each individual shot. In continuous advance, the camera will fire off the bracketed shots in one continuous burst if you keep your finger pressed fully on the shutter button. There are two ways to set auto exposure bracketing. If you want to use the menu, press the menu button and scroll to the third Shooting menu. Highlight Exposure Compensation and Auto Exposure Bracketing. Press Set. Rotate the top main dial clockwise. A long vertical line appears on the exposure scale indicating the correct exposure value. Additional smaller lines indicate the exposure settings for the bracketed under and over exposed images. You can choose to keep the exposure differences close together or spread them apart depending on your selection of stop increments. When you've made your choice, press Set to save your settings. Another method is to press the Q button to access the Quick Control menu. Use the multi-controller to highlight the Exposure Compensation AEB setting. Turn the top main dial clockwise to change the settings. You'll see multiple indicator marks appear under the scale. Keep turning the main dial to set the amount you want the exposures to vary by. Sometimes, instead of shooting an AEB sequence with under and overexposed shots, you may only want to expose in one direction. For example, you may want to take one shot with correct exposure, one overexposed by one stop, and another overexposed by two stops. This is easy to do by combining auto bracketing with exposure compensation. Once you've set an auto bracketing amount, simply turn the rear quick control dial to move the entire AEB scale toward the under or over exposure side. You can shift the entire bracketed sequence in either direction. If you started with a 3-shot AEB sequence with each shot one stop apart, by moving the quick control dial in the plus direction one stop, you would now have a sequence of normal, plus one stop, and plus two stops. There are additional auto exposure bracketing options. Press the menu button, highlight Custom Functions 1, Exposure, and press Set. Use the quick control dial or the multi-controller to dial in the custom function you want. Here are the options that impact auto exposure bracketing. Custom Function 1.3, Bracketing Auto Cancel. Auto bracketing is normally cleared when the camera is turned off. If you want to retain your AEB settings even after the camera has been shut off, select Option 1, Off. Now, to clear auto bracketing, you need to go into the Shooting menu and manually reset it to 0. Custom Function 1.4, Bracketing Sequence. The default setting is the correct exposure first, followed by underexposed, and then overexposed. But you can opt to start with the underexposed shot first by setting Option 1, or start with the overexposed shot first by setting Option 2. Custom Function 1.5, Number of bracketed shots. The default setting is 3, but you can choose to capture 2, 5, or 7 bracketed images. If you select 2, your choice of bracketing sequence in Custom Function 1.4 dictates whether you get an over or underexposed image along with a normally exposed one. Auto bracketing can be a quick, precise, and repeatable way to get varied exposures in challenging situations, or simply to have slightly different images to select from. Combining it with exposure compensation gives even more control over exposure and can be a real asset in situations where you need to work fast.